Are we ready, Rhea? Okay. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see some of you again. Hi, Sucker. Um, I'm really glad that you're all here, and welcome to Elizabeth Ault as well. My name is Erin Pettigrew, and I am a professor in the History and Arab Crossroads Studies programs, and with Natalie Pertz and Alex and Rhea, we organize events and programming for the Humanities Research Fellowship in the Study of the Arab World. And this is now an annual event, this publication workshop. But this year, and I know Elizabeth joined us last year. This year we did want to sort of change a little bit about how we did the workshop, primarily because of experiences both Natalie and I have had of working with developmental editors and feeling like that was an immensely helpful and yet unspoken practice. And in looking to hire a developmental editor myself, when I was finishing my book, or when I was working on revisions for my book, someone had recommended it to me, and I had absolutely no idea what a developmental editor did. I didn't know how such a person was different from a copy editor. And I came to really understand how many people hire developmental editors and how many of my colleagues at this institution did, and I had no idea. And so it seemed to be this thing that people didn't talk about, and I guess I really advocate for talking about it. So we've also invited Katherine Wiley here today to talk about what kind of work developmental editors do. So we hope that having both an acquisitions editor here and a developmental editor will help you see the kind of range of possibilities of processes and work that you can consider at no matter what stage you're at, although we have been promoting this as primarily a dissertations to first monograph kind of workshop. So as I said, both Elizabeth Ault, and I'll introduce her, and Katherine Wiley in a second, are here as two experts in this process. And what we hope today is that you'll come away from the panel discussion with practical advice about revising your dissertation primarily, but also writing more generally. So for those who aren't just working on their first book, writing a book proposal, approaching editors, signing a first contract, and navigating the peer review and publication process, which I think can often be a kind of painful process. And we also really want to, as I was saying, demystify this process, which is why we invited both Elizabeth and Katherine here to discuss how editors work, what their expectations are, and how you can fill what can seem to be a gap between your dissertation or an initial piece of draft writing and the final product that you hope will be published. So I'll introduce Elizabeth and Katherine now, and then I have specific questions for each of them. We're assuming that might go about 45 minutes. I'll try to really keep it to under that, and then we'll have about 45 minutes for questions and answers from all of you. And Elizabeth and Katherine, feel free if you want to add to what either of you is saying to jump in as well. So Elizabeth Ault, thank you so much for being here virtually, is an editor at Duke University Press, where she's in charge of the lists of African and Middle East studies, Black and Latinx studies, trans studies, disability studies, critical studies of prisons and policing, and sociology. She has published almost 50 first-time authors, and prior to joining Duke Press in 2012, she received a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. And then to my left, Katherine Wiley is the owner of Goldenrod Editorial, where she's a developmental editor. In this role, she assists clients in meeting their publishing goals by helping them to think through the bigger picture issues with their work, including argument, structure, narrative flow, and voice. Katherine has her PhD in anthropology from Indiana University and was formerly a tenured professor at Pacific Lutheran University. Her book, Work, Gender, and Social Status in Post-Slavery Mauritania, explores how female slave descendants are making a living and building meaningful lives for themselves. So thank you both for being here. So Elizabeth, if you don't mind, I'll begin with you. I wanted to ask if you could give us a general explanation of what an acquisitions editor does and doesn't do, as well as an overview of Duke University Press, its strengths, and what it publishes.
Absolutely. Yeah, and thank you so much again for inviting me back. It's an honor, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person. I heard some people discussing the snacks, and they sound delicious. So I will just be continuing to think about the apple and peanut butter that I just had. But yeah, so I have been working in acquisitions for almost a decade, actually over a decade. Over a decade, I started at Duke Press in the summer of 2022. And I had similar questions before I came to this position. I think there is a lot of confusion because there's sort of 3 different jobs that all have the same title, editor. And I think, Katherine will speak more about developmental editing. Erin also mentioned how developmental editing is not copy editing, which is a whole 3rd category. And then there's acquisitions editors. And so the metaphor that I like to use for my job is sort of like, from the times when like record labels didn't just like sit on TikTok and watch for the best content there, but like would go to clubs and like go to shows and like be part of a local scene and figure out like what are the bands and like what are the trends, like or like a talent scout for a baseball team. I'm like very bad at sports metaphors, but I understand a lot of people get them. So acquisitions editors are really responsible for thinking kind of about the shape of fields. So you heard Erin in my bio say that I am acquiring across these fields. And my own background is interdisciplinary in nature. So I'm sort of also always trying to think about how these fields are in relation to each other, or could be in relation, or could be in conversation. And so I'm going to conferences again. They're happening again. I think the last time I was here, everything was online, but in-person conferences are happening again. And so I'm about to go to American Studies, Women's Studies, African Studies, Middle East Studies, all of these conferences, and just sort of kind of keeping an ear to the ground, both checking in with authors that you've worked with before, asking people, what are you hearing at these panels that you're going to, kind of keeping an eye on, like in the book exhibit, at the conference, there's a big room that's just full of different publishers exhibiting their books. That's incredibly valuable information for you as a prospective author to see what kind of press is publishing what kind of book. It's also really valuable for us as editors to see like, oh, here's what Stanford's doing this year. Here are the new books from California Press. Like, oh, this press has never come to this conference before. And just really to get a sense of the personalities of each publisher, as well as kind of, are there certain words that are in the titles of all of the books that are on the posters, and what booths is everyone going to? These sorts of things. So I think as an acquisition editor, we're really responsible for working with people to both understand what those trends are and also to kind of shape them, right? And sort of think about where's the future of thinking, where's the field going, what are people going to need? And working closely with individual authors on projects that are part of those trends that shape those fields. And we may do anything from, hear from an author about a really amazing student and meet with someone prior to them defending their dissertation. And then talk with them for the next, this is not an exaggeration, 7 years as their book project comes together and they work on revising their dissertation. We may, we have at Duke Press, we have an online submissions portal. So someone may submit a project, a proposal, and 2 sample chapters through that portal. I've never met them before. I've never heard about their work, but the proposal is phenomenal. The chapters are great. And the manuscript is ready. So then I, send one email and then there's a manuscript and then, so sometimes it's as simple as that. So it really runs the gamut, and there's I think that's what makes it a little hard to talk about. And Erin, I really appreciate you saying that there are so many of these like hidden norms in publishing. And I'm grateful to be part of a session that's working on demystifying that process a little bit. So I think one thing to take away from that is that it's never too early to approach an acquisitions editor, but it's also not too late. So there are many different ways that a relationship can look like. But what an acquisitions editor will do, ideally, is discuss with an author, I think generally sort of high level things, sort of like, what's the argument of your book? Who's the audience for your book? Is it an argument that makes sense within that press's list? Is it an audience that press knows how to reach? And then also in thinking about audience, we're thinking about peer reviewers. So a main thing that acquisitions editors do is shepherd a book through the peer review process. So we're the ones who are responsible. I think of it as really being an advocate for the book. So trying to advocate for the book to become the strongest version of itself, both through working with the author to refine the arguments, the organization, those sorts of things prior to sending a book out for peer review, to advocate for the project through picking peer reviewers who are going to understand what the author's doing and want the author to do it well, right? I think there's a lot of kind of nightmare peer review stories, and maybe Erin, you have a question about that, so we can get into that at a later moment. But I love peer review. I think that's the best part of my job as an acquisitions editor, is to really be able to facilitate this type of intellectual exchange that happens in that process. But it's something we take very seriously because we want reviewers who are going to want the book to do well. You know, rarely as an acquisitions editor am I saying, oh, I'm on the fence about a project, so let me send it out and the peer reviewers will tell me if it's any good or not. If an acquisitions editor is sending your book out, it's usually because they believe in it strongly and want to publish it. They want it to work, and want to pick peer reviewers, not who won't be rigorous and give critical feedback, but who will give feedback that's intended to make the project as strong as possible. Once we have peer reviews, acquisitions editors are also responsible for navigating a contract process. So there may also be a question about that. So we won't get too deep into that. And then making sure that the book is approved by the editorial board. And those are the two processes that make an academic press different from a trade publisher or other kinds of publishing. Is both everything we publish has to be peer reviewed and it has to be approved by our editorial advisory board. And then the work of the acquisitions editor is sort of, you know, we explain the book to colleagues in marketing. We're advocating for the book there again. We're saying this is, you know, how it's similar to things we've done, why it's going to do better. It's going to sell better than that thing we did that was similar. Here's why the author is so great, and here's how they'll be able to reach the audiences that we want to reach. And then once the book is out, we do play a role, I think, in helping to promote it, in recommending it to other people, and thinking about those sorts of processes, and in continuing to have relationships with authors, right? And sort of thinking about how the book is out in the world, potentially working on future projects together. And Duke Press, I would say, is known for a few things. One, since I just talked a little bit about peer review, I'd say the rigor of our editorial process across the board, regardless of field. We do have a pretty distinct commitment, I think, to peer review. And then, you know, and I think part of that is because, as I mentioned at the beginning, and I am going to wrap up because I've been talking for a really long time, is projects that do sort of reach out across fields in surprising ways, right? Projects that are interdisciplinary in ways that might or might not be expected, that are maybe taking a concept or a method from one field and bringing it to questions in a different field. That's part of why our peer review is so rigorous, because if a project is trying to speak across fields, it's important to make sure it's actually doing that. And I think it's part of why we're known for books that are surprising, books that are maybe counterintuitive. A question that I sort of think about a lot as an acquisitions editor at Duke is maybe not the question of what the book is about. I think that's often the way that people describe their work, is like, you know, what do you work on? Oh, I work on garbage workers in Senegal. This is a book that I worked on with Rosie Fredericks at NYU. But the question is like, what does the book do? And what that book does is it puts conversation about labor and spirituality at the forefront to change the way that we think about infrastructure, right? So those are sort of two related but different things. And I think Duke books, we're always thinking about what is the book doing in addition to what the book is about. Thank you.
Thank you for that last articulation, especially too. One of the questions I asked you, and I just wondered if I could sort of go back to that, is what you don't do. And so I just wondered if there's a misconception that you encounter over and over again when, you know, possible authors reach out to you about what your role is. And, you know, maybe that has shifted in the last couple of decades as university presses might be shifting, but is there something that you see that people sort of anticipate you would be doing as an acquisitions editor that you have to kind of diplomatically explain you don't do sometimes?
I'd say like less with potential authors. I feel like there's been a proliferation of information available on the internet, like Laura Portwood Stacer doing the work to explain like how university presses work, because apparently we've been very bad at it for several decades. So I experience a lot of like confusion from people who are not in the academy or colleagues at Duke who are like, oh, the press, like the newsletter, sure, right, like no, or like that we publish textbooks, which is not quite right. But in terms of what we actually do and don't do, right, we're not copy editors. I'm not doing a line edit of the book. I think acquisitions editors are also have some of the roles of a trade editor, a book editor in trade publishing, where someone is often doing those like deep line edits and developmental edits, which I know Katherine will be talking about. But the reality is our job is acquisitions editor, or in a UK context, maybe commissioning editor. And so our concern is much more about making sure that we are building a pipeline of work that's going out into the world. And up until quite recently, and Erin, I think this might be what your question is getting at, you know, a lot of academic books were not written to be read by people, right? They were written to be purchased by libraries as part of an acquisition plan because it's a book in a field and we'll just buy a copy of this and have it. As library budgets have diminished, publishers can no longer rely on selling, you know, thousands of dollars worth of books to libraries. And so we actually are much more reliant on individual people buying and reading our books. So it is more important than ever that the books be readable, be books people want to read. And I think at Duke, we're also known for our experimental writing and publishing books that maybe are more creative nonfiction, that bring sort of activist and intellectual concerns together. But the unfortunate reality is that unlike an editor at a trade press who may only be working on, you know, 5 books at a time and diving in really deeply, most of us are working on anywhere from 30 to 50 projects at a time. So we just can't get in the manuscript as deeply as I think many of us would like to. And that is perhaps why the importance of developmental editors has burgeoned in recent years. Oh, another thing I'll say is that at Duke Press, we like to send out for first books full manuscripts. I do think maybe we'll talk about book proposals later, but that is like for me as a developmental editor or as an acquisitions editor, sorry, I struggle with book proposals. I don't really like them. I find them to be this sort of like aspirational genre that talks about like, here's what my book is going to do. And sometimes I'm very susceptible to believe the hype. I'm like, yeah, this book is totally going to change the way I think about this thing. And then sort of you get the chapter or the introduction. It's like, this is a great book, but it's not the book that I imagined from the proposal. And so then that like friction can be a challenge. So I think a lot of acquisitions editors really love book proposals. So this is just a me thing. And again, maybe this is something we'll talk about later, but yeah.
Well, I think that gets at my next question, which is what is the biggest difference between a dissertation and a book? And I suppose maybe book proposal could also be a part of that, but I was going to ask you what some of the most common challenges are that you encounter among authors submitting their first books. And so maybe that is one of them. And how one should envision the evolution from dissertation to book manuscript.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is I wrote the dissertation as a book. And I understand that in certain fields like sociology, where maybe you have the option of like, I wrote 5 separate articles and then like wrote an introduction about my thoughts on method or whatever, versus my 5 chapters are all part of the same case study. Maybe, but there's no possible way to write your dissertation like a book because the dissertation and the book have 2 very different objectives. So again, if we go back to the outcome, the question of like, what is the book about versus what does the book do? What a dissertation does is it is the completion of your education. You know, it is sort of the proof that you are able, that you're qualified, you're certified to make the claims that you want to make. Right. And so often what I hear happening, and sort of what happened to me, is that you sort of figure out what kind of argument you're really making at your defense. It's like it's in the conclusion of the dissertation. You're like, oh, this is like what I've been saying the whole time. And so then the process of writing the book is sort of the process of kind of stripping out all of the things from the dissertation that helped it to serve that initial function of certification, of verification. So often the language that feels dissertation-y is very defensive, right? It's like everyone else thinks this and they're wrong. And it's like, well, does everyone think that? You know, or you know, these sorts of things that are very like, I'm gonna overturn the received wisdom in the field, and which maybe you are, but I think it's far better in a book to sort of take more, to sort of step into your power, I guess, as a thinker and a writer. So instead of saying why everyone else is wrong or what the gap is in the literature that you're filling, is to just sort of proactively put forward what is so helpful about your book. What is your book going to help people understand differently? What is your book going to change? What tool is your book offering? And why is that tool so needed? And I think just a lot of the way that graduate students get sort of socialized and trained is about being very critical, is about finding the sort of gaps and problems in other people's arguments. And I think what you're doing as an author of a book is really trying to explain what your intellectual kind of community is and how it's a continued conversation, right? And so you don't like, it's very challenging to have a conversation if you're just like, well, everyone else is stupid. Like this is not really what you want to do. And I think so that's a real change in a book, is just a change of perspective from being a student to being the author, to being the expert, right? You don't need to have 17 citations because you have that one committee member who like didn't think you read enough in your oral. So you're really trying to prove to them like, I have mastered this now and I have read all of these books. It's like, you need to have the best example, the most important citation. You really need to sort of strip out a lot of the direct quotes and do a lot more, glossing in your own language with judicious footnoting. Again, maybe if you had that one ethnographic example where you really figured out what you were doing, but maybe then once you saw that, you had like 5 other examples, and maybe one of those is actually the best one, right? So can you let go of the one that's most important to you and focus on really building an argument around the best example, the most useful example? And so I think that to me is the biggest challenge, is just really imagining yourself as the expert, as the person guiding people through, as someone that people want to trust, as opposed to thinking that you have to really win people's trust, but to say, I've got this, I've got you. How do you reimagine the book as something for an audience that isn't your dissertation committee members, that is for people that you don't know and might never meet? And how do you kind of invite them in to your intellectual project?
Can I ask you, Elizabeth, just because there are some people here who have already published a first book, and so I'm also just wondering, is there a difference in second time authors that you see when it comes to these issues?
Yes and no. I mean, I think the second book is really different. I mean, I think it can be this amazing opportunity for people to like take a further like intellectual leap that's so exciting. But I think the challenges are really different, because for a first book, as anxiety producing, as fraught as your attachment to the whole dissertation process and dissertation product itself might be, in most cases, people's first books are drawn from whatever that was. So there is some structure, there's something that you're building on, there's some sense that like, oh, this was vetted by a committee. There's some sense of like, oh, I developed this project in conversation and with these kinds of supports. And for the second book, most people don't have that. And I think it's like as fraught and bad and maybe traumatizing as graduate school can be for a lot of people, it is also for most people a time of like relative lack of obligation. So most people in graduate school aren't teaching a 2-2 or a 4-4. Most people in graduate school don't have as many service obligations as, especially people who've written a first book, maybe you've already got tenure, right? So now, congratulations, your life is service. And so if you're lucky enough to be on a tenure track position, obviously, you maybe have different life obligations. Maybe you didn't have kids in graduate school and now you do, or maybe your parents were healthy in graduate school and now they're sick, or I think it's just the second book hits a lot of people at a very different stage of life and career, and it can be really hard to develop a new intellectual project from scratch in that context. So I mean, and obviously you're not really working from scratch. You have the track record that you built from your first book. Surely different questions came up. Many people start new projects while they're working on the first book that are sort of things that can't be contained in there, or maybe it's even a thread from the dissertation that didn't make sense for the argument of the first book that you're picking back up. But it is really different, I think, to sort of feel like you're a little bit more on your own, and some people really relish that, and that's also very daunting for some people. So I definitely have second book authors who are like, I want to do this by myself. I'm so excited to like not have to develop this project by committee. I will talk to you when I have the completed manuscript, and like we'll deal with it then. And then there are other people who are like get as far as a proposal and maybe a couple of sample chapters that are based on articles that they published, even maybe while working on the first book, or things that are like, well, I can figure out how to get these articles into like chapter form, but I really need help. Like, I want to send this out at the proposal and chapter stage because I need people to tell me if I'm on the right track, you know? And so I think it's just, it's a different kind of opportunity, and it comes with different kinds of challenges.
Thank you. And then I'm going to ask you one last question, and we'll go to Katherine because time is escaping me. But I know there'll be, questions from everyone else who's here. I just wondered, and understanding, as you've already pointed out, that you have your specific preferences for process. For example, you talked about not sending a book proposal necessarily, but you wanting to see the full manuscript. Could you talk, I guess, generally, if possible, or if specifically about your process, you find that more helpful, just about the stages people should really think about when it comes to publication? I know people often ask, when does it make sense for an author to reach out to an editor? And you mentioned, conferences being one place, online portal being another. Is it okay? A question I've run into, is it okay to reach out to several editors at the same time? I think there used to be an understanding that one shouldn't do that, but maybe increasingly that isn't necessarily the advice.
Yeah, those are great questions. And I think the answers do vary depending on the stage, right? So as you're working to develop your book proposal, working on your sample chapters, refining and clarifying the book manuscript, and having the sort of project settle into shape, it's completely fine to approach a number of presses. It's completely fine to send that proposal and sample chapters to a number of places. I would say when you should start thinking about really only being in conversation with one or maybe two people is when you start building a relationship with someone. So, if you have an hour-long meeting with someone, if they give you detailed feedback on your work, if they're really engaging with your project and you're finding it helpful. I mean, if they're engaging with your project and you're not finding it helpful, then probably they're not the editor for you. And that's also really important information. But I think the more if you're meeting with someone at every year to check in about your project over 5 years, it's like, maybe then don't talk to another editor. So I think it really is about relationships. And that to me is much more determinative of like when I would feel hurt or like someone had maybe behaved a little bit unprofessionally in sharing the materials with multiple editors. If I feel like I had put a lot of work into it and the person was like, well, see you later, that is maybe inappropriate. But if you're just submitting an initial proposal and sample chapters, or if it is the big conference in your field and you're reaching out to multiple editors for initial conversations, that's totally fine, completely expected. And that's just an understanding that, publishers need authors as much as authors need publishers. And that's just real. And you do want to find the press that gets your work, that's going to be an advocate for it, where it's going to be on a shelf or on a list in a catalog at the book exhibit with books that are similar, right? That it's gonna find the right audience, and that's really important. So again, for first books, we do like to send out a completed manuscript. That's sort of a press-wide policy. There are fields where there's more or less flexibility, or projects where it might make sense, but in general, at Duke, we like to send out a full manuscript. So again, if you're sort of in that stage between like, we've had a great conversation about the proposal and sample chapters, and then all of a sudden you send the manuscript and you're like, well, I'm sending this full manuscript to 4 presses. It's like, that's a little bit trickier. So I think, again, with initial submissions, it's fine to go broad. Once you're at the point of an editor is going to send things out for review, I think it's really tricky, and you really only want to have that maybe with 1, 2, or 2 presses. Because again, as I said in my first sort of answer, an editor isn't sending your materials out usually to see if they like them. They're sending them out because they like them, because they want to publish the book, and they need the validation of external reviewers in order to be able to offer a contract. So it's very rare that I'm sending something out thinking it's not going to work out, and like this person really might need a backup. Like you usually do not need a safety school, is what I tell people. If you are going to go the route of simultaneous submission, once you get to that peer review point, you do just want to make sure that you're very clear about what's going on, that you keep both presses apprised of the progress, and that you don't just go with the press that gets reports back first, but really give the process time to play out at both presses. So that's sort of the biggest kind of, there's a lot of conversation that can happen A lot of back and forth that can happen over proposals, chapters, initial consultations, even a manuscript I'll sometimes send feedback on before I'm ready to send it out for review. Then sending things out for peer review. There's sort of, people are probably aware a little bit of a peer review. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a crisis, but I would call it a slowdown in the humanities book reviewing world at this time. I think we're seeing it's taking, we're having to ask more people in order to find the right two reviewers, especially again in interdisciplinary work where we might want someone who is a sociologist and someone who knows the context of Zambia. We don't expect there to be like, multiple sociologists that work on Zambia, for example. This is a random example, but, so we're trying to find the right combination of people, and that can take longer. We're finding that we used to say sort of a 6 to 8 week turnaround. We're now finding people are taking closer to 10 weeks, 12 weeks. I used to say it's like pretty solid that if you when I start to query reviewers, the time from when I start to query reviewers to the time when I'm sending reports, I used to say 3 months. That's now usually aspirational rather than standard. It's definitely extending a little bit longer. I would say 6 months is not atypical now. So, I mean, another thing the acquisitions editor does, right, is we send along the reports and work to help people make sense of them. And then once we've sent those reports, the author writes a response to them. And that's another kind of difference, right, between the dissertation and the book. When you're getting feedback on your book manuscript, it's not like getting feedback on your dissertation where maybe you like have to make these changes in order to pass. This is much more like, how does this feedback fit with your vision for the book? Right, oftentimes when people see a problem, and maybe Katherine will speak to this too, they'll offer a solution because they're trying to be helpful. But the solution they offer does not have to be the solution that you go with, right? Like you can address the problem that they're identifying, the reader's identifying, in a different way that makes more sense for how you want to write your book. And so that's part of just writing the response to the reports, is figuring out how to synthesize and digest that information in a way that honors you as the author of the book. But also, importantly, is like not defensive about why you did things the way you did them, but is working to look forward and resolve the problem. So then once we have reports and a response, I can go to the contract committee. And again, that's a slightly different process at Duke. Our contract committee is an internal staff committee. A lot of presses have the board weigh in at the contract time. So at Duke, we have a lot of flexibility about what we sign up because the board comes in at the end of the process. But at another press, you may have to think about like, oh, I'm writing to the board for this response. Like the board is going to see this response in addition to the peer reviewers and the editor. So it's important to think about the audience for the response as well. Is this the question you were asking, Erin? Is just like, what are the steps? Okay. So once the contract is approved, you go off and do the revisions. And then again, it depends on the press. So if the board had approved your contract, at many presses, the acquisitions editor is the only one who needs to review the manuscript. Maybe they can then say like, yeah, sure, this person did everything, this is ready to go, and kind of move forward. At Duke, we need to send the manuscript out for a sign-off review. So ideally, we like to go back to the edit, at least one of the reviewers who saw it in the first round, assuming they were supportive. Because they'll be more familiar with the process. And so then again, we have, and again, we hope it can go faster in the second round. We sometimes are finding that it does not go faster, but I'd say again, about 3 months for that person to assess the revisions and ensure that the book is ready for publication. And once the reviewer signs off, then we can take things to our editorial advisory board for final approval. While all that's happening, authors are working on things like, if you want to include images in your book, that's your responsibility to get high resolution images. If they're images from an archive or a famous artist or something, you may need to ask permission to reproduce those images in your book. Duke is very staunchly fair use first, and we'd be happy to work with you on figuring out fair use sources if possible. But sometimes you do need to get permission. And so that's something that can be happening during the process of review and board, making sure that all of the materials are finalized, including, that the manuscript citations are in the correct format and they're consistent and you've written your acknowledgements and all of these things. And then once all those materials are finalized and the book is approved by the editorial board, it can go into production. And production is where things like copy editing happen. That's where your book will be laid out into page proofs. And that usually happens about 6 months after the book goes into production. And that's when, for example, the book can be indexed because the page numbers are there. A lot of people think like, they need to line up the indexer before the book can go into production. And it's like, well, what would they be indexing? Because it's not, the pages are not there. So at Duke, again, right now, there have been a number of slowdowns in the past couple of years due to things like, even before the pandemic, 2 of the top 10, the 10 biggest book publishers, book printers in the US went out of business. And then on top of that, we have like these sort of mega blockbuster books like the Michelle Obama memoir. There was a whole article about this in the New York Times. Like every single printer in the US was printing that book. And therefore like shoving print jobs from small presses that are not printing 5 million copies of books kind of down the queue. Paper manufacturers switched to making cardboard boxes instead of making paper for books. So it's sort of like this perfect storm of terrible things. Like last spring, you guys might have heard there was a container full of cookbooks that were like being shipped from China that somehow ended up off the coast of Portugal. And then there was a storm and the container fell overboard. So like Melissa Clark's cookbook was just at the bottom of the ocean. So all of these exciting things are happening in book publishing, but 12 months from the time we send materials into production to the time when we have books in our warehouse. And those are, so that's copy editing, page proofs, indexing. If there's publicity that's happening for the book in advance, getting that out, and those sorts of things. You'll be in touch with a marketing team once your book is in production, who will want to talk about things like endorsements. At Duke, we have an in-house copywriter, so you don't have to write the back cover copy. Some presses you do. We also will solicit the endorsements for you. I'm not sure how that process works at other presses. We'll work on the cover. Duke Press is known for its beautiful covers. So we always, our in-house designers are a big part of that. They definitely welcome feedback from authors that have the final say. At another press, you may just be asked to provide a certain size of image and they have a template cover and they'll just slot that image in there. But all of those sorts of things about the physical package of the book and how it's going to go out into the world happen once the book is in production. And so there are still lots of like little things and decisions to be made once the substantive intellectual work of writing the book is done. And then the book comes out and then you get to give lots of talks about it. Some of them on Zoom, some of them in person. You get to pose with the book at the booth for your author photo or take a selfie with it. And then, yeah, so maybe there could be questions about that, but that's sort of the culmination of the process.
Great, thank you so much, Elizabeth. I have a lot of questions, but I'll wait and see what those coming from the audience are. So if I can turn to Katherine and ask you a similar sort of question at the beginning, as I asked Elizabeth, which is what is developmental editing? What do you do and what don't you do?
First, thanks to everybody at NYU for having me here. And I love meeting with some of you earlier today and I'm excited to meet with some of you later in the week. So I also, like Erin, I didn't know what developmental editing was actually when I was writing my first book. I learned about it on Facebook after my book came out and was like, what? So anyway, I love talking about developmental editing because I wish I had known about it. It would have made the process so much easier for me. So to give a general overview of what developmental editors do, we work directly with authors, sometimes with presses as well. But I right now I'm exclusively working with authors, and we help authors think through the big picture issues in their book. So helping you think through things like argument, structure, organization, voice, narrative flow, and that can happen at any stage in the process. So I work with authors who literally have nothing written, and so I'm helping people like conceptualize the book, right? Think through like, what am I trying to say in this? What chapters do I want to write? How should they go? Also, developmental editors work with folks who have a manuscript, reading the manuscript and providing feedback, and that can be a dissertation. So sometimes folks come saying, like, I have this dissertation, I need to turn it into a book. What do I do? What do you suggest? Sometimes it's someone who has edited the dissertation pretty heavily, right? But they want another set of eyes on it before they send the full manuscript to Duke or wherever they're going to send it. Sometimes it's at the stage where people have gotten reader reports, and they're trying to navigate how to revise the book, how to make sense of these reports, like helping to chart a path forward with the book. So that would involve reading the manuscript and the reviews, right? And then helping to talk through like, what aspects of these should we do and how, and what maybe do you think isn't going to work for the book, and how can you sort of justify those decisions as well. And then sometimes I work with authors at an even later stage where they have gotten reviews, revised the book on their own, it goes back to the press, and the press says it still needs more work. And that obviously can be a really stressful moment. What developmental editing looks like in practice generally, and developmental editors, one thing about editing, which I have learned since I've become one, is to some extent, especially for developmental editing, there's not necessarily like a standard practice. For copy editing, you know, there's, let's say, the Chicago Manual of Style, although copy editing is complicated too. But anyway, there's no sort of like set thing developmental editors are doing. So one thing you want to be sure when you're deciding to work with someone is that you really understand what they do, and what sort of product they're going to give you, because that can look very different. How I work, and I think this is generally what people do, is I would read the manuscript, usually through twice, making comments in the margin about the kinds of issues that I was talking about, and then write a detailed, what we call an editorial letter. And that, to some extent, is like a reader report, but it usually summarizes whatever you've read, like reviews the argument, and then provides detailed feedback on various aspects of the manuscript. And those would be those kind of overarching topics I named in the beginning: structure, organization, argument, flow. They'd also might respond to directions from the author, right? So say an author might be anxious about, they're wanting to like frame their chapters with vignettes, but they're worried that maybe they're not like reaching the readers, or can you pay attention to like helping me think through how to make these examples more vivid, or how to better connect with the argument. So that would sort of be the product. Developmental editors can also work throughout the whole process. So I'm working with some authors now who are writing their books. And so that might mean they're sending me chapters every couple of months. And I'm reading those chapters and giving feedback on the individual chapters, but also keeping a bigger picture of the whole book in mind. So helping them think like, how does this chapter fit with your overarching argument? Or maybe feedback like, you know, this chapter makes me think that maybe your argument's not exactly what you initially thought it was, right? So in a sense, it's like being in conversation with somebody. I think what my favorite part about being a developmental editor, having been in academia, is I get to be on authors' teams, right? Like I'm there to support the people I work with, to help them achieve their best products that they can, to help them understand the process. And that's really exciting to me, because I felt, and I hope this is not your experience, you know, but academia can be kind of adversarial, right? And a lot of times, even with peers, it feels a little bit competitive, right? And so I think developmental editors are really there to nurture authors and to help you get like the best products you can, so that then when you're sending things to Elizabeth, you're feeling, you know, like this is the best product I could send at this moment, right? I feel ready for the stage. Another thing developmental editors do, and I've been surprised how often authors say to me, like, I'm partly paying you for the deadlines and the accountability, right? Because it's hard to get writing done. And just as Elizabeth said, you have so many more responsibilities, right? And so some authors like to work in different ways, but with some people, we literally map out the year, right? Like you're going to send me X in February, Y in April, whatever. And of course, those deadlines change, right? But it helps people sort of map out, what do I need to get done, and when, and how can I do that? Another thing, and again, developmental editors work in different ways. Some developmental editors also do a form of, we call it lots of different things, writing coaching, we call it like developmental coaching. So that's actually meeting with authors to, like, sometimes it can be to actually talk about your writing. Some authors like to meet with editors or coaches to help strategize, like how can I get writing done, or just set goals for particular periods. So I have some people I meet with every other week or maybe monthly, and we talk through like, what do you need to accomplish in this next month? How can we get that done? And sometimes also talking about like just talking through their arguments, right? So I might not have actually read their work, but they'll sort of, it's someone to brainstorm with, right? And listen and kind of help you see your work in new ways. And that's, I think, a big thing developmental editors do, right? Is sort of help you see your work with fresh eyes. Okay, things I do not do. And this is again, and some developmental editors do this. I don't copy edit. So that means like I don't read for like grammar, punctuation, things like this. There are lots of like specific copy editors who can help you with that work. And again, probably like pretty late in the process, right? You want your work like fairly far along. Some developmental editors do also do copy editing. So sometimes that would be, they might do a developmental edit, you revise it, and then later they do a copy edit. One thing I do and most developmental editors do is line editing. So that's actually like getting into the text itself and maybe helping, say, smooth transitions. That's a thing I see missing in a lot of books, is like not published books. In manuscripts I see, right, but it's like transitions between sections, between paragraphs. Line editing might also help with flow of the text, right, and so on. So that's like literally using track changes in Word and working on the documents. And again, that some authors kind of want me to do both simultaneously. For lots of people, I just do developmental edits, so I wouldn't actually be using track changes really in the text at all, except sometimes I see like something just like a double word or whatever, and I can't help but to read it, right? Another thing we do not do is write your book for you, right? And you do get requests that kind of border on that, right? They're not like just write a book from scratch, right? But people who have some material, but kind of hope that you will turn that material into a book. So we don't do that, right? But we do, advise different pathways your book can take. And one last thing, and I'll go to the next question. I think a difference between reader reviews generally and the kind of feedback you get from developmental editors is we help like point out areas that we think could benefit from revision, and then we provide pathways you could take to achieve those revisions. And as Elizabeth said, these pathways might not be things you ultimately decide to do, right? The book is always your own and your vision. But I think by giving you concrete steps you could take to do the revisions, it can spark new ideas, right? And I say this to my authors sometimes, right? If you like hate the suggestion that I told you, like said, this is something you could decide, that also tells you something about your work, right? And helps you sort of see your work. So just an example of that is a lot of authors come to me knowing that there are structural issues with the book, right? And feeling like the structure isn't working. So if that's the case, I might read it and then provide, suggest, I could imagine you rearranging the chapters in this way A, and here's why I think that might work for the book. But another way you could do it is way B, and like here that is. And here's why that might work. And sometimes when we're offering multiple pathways, it's partly about time, right? And as Elizabeth is saying, how much time it takes to get a book published. Editors can also help you think through what's realistic, right? Especially given tenure clocks and pressure and you just wanting to get this thing out of your life, right? What are kind of realistic pathways for revision that can get your book done, get your book published, and so on.
Thank you, Katherine. So my one final question I have, because you actually touched on some of my other questions in your response, which was really helpful. From your experience so far, I'm just wondering if you can give us a big kind of general statement about the biggest differences you see between a dissertation and a book. And how can one learn to think like an author in the way Elizabeth said, the difference being this book is about X topic versus this book does Y.
Yeah, I was talking with some of you earlier today about this. To me, and again, not all dissertations are written this way, right? But I think many of us write your dissertation in pieces, right? And you're usually crunched for time, right? So it's like, here's chapter one, here's chapter, and so you don't have a lot of time to think about how those chapters hang together, right? And sometimes, honestly, like they don't necessarily, right? So to me, I think the big difference between the book and the dissertation is the book has some kind of, it does something in the world, as Elizabeth said, and it has a sort of overarching argument and through line that the chapters not only relate to, but build on. So there's something like propelling the reader through the book, right? And you're picking up more with each chapter until you reach the conclusion. And so I think having something that's like a coherent whole where each piece adds to that and builds on the other pieces is generally very different from dissertations. And I think, so that's one thing I see a lot. I think, as Elizabeth already said, I'll just again say, like, to me, you see a dissertation and you can tell it was written for 4 people, right? And I think another thing is 4 people who you knew generally fairly well, right? So you knew so-and-so is not gonna let this pass if Marx isn't part of it or whatever, right? Your committee members' preferences and so on. And so for the book, it's thinking more broadly about audience, right? So scholars in this particular subfield, right? Maybe you're thinking about some sort of more general readership and so on. So trying to think, how can you make the book appeal to beyond 4 people and make it meaningful to a larger group? And I think how to achieve, I think one way to achieve that is to, when you're finished with your dissertation, take a little break, and then go back to it and try to go back to it with fresh eyes, and start trying to map through, like, what is the overarching argument, right? What fits, what doesn't? What is this overarching structure? How can I make sure there's a through line and the chapters build? And I'll just throw out a couple books I've just recently read that I think, well, one I read a long time ago. If you haven't read From Dissertation to Book by Germano, I do think it's worth a read. It's a pretty short book, and he does a lot. He was in publishing for like 20 years, and now he's a professor. But he talks very practically about, like, what's the difference? How can you revise your dissertation? He's a firm believer that you should revise your dissertation in a year, which I think is a little unrealistic for many people, but he does give a lot of practical suggestions for how to do that. And I actually recently, he has a new book out called On Revision, which is a little, well, it's kind of philosophical, and there's a lot of time spent sort of thinking about, like, what is revising and so on, which in a sense I hesitate to recommend it to authors, just because I feel like when I want to revise, I want really practical stuff. But he also it's divided. The second part is about argument, structure, and audience, and he does have very practical suggestions for, like, how do you go back and rethink your structure. For example, he suggests read it backwards and almost like outline it backwards and see, like, do things build on each other and so on. So you might, if the philosophical stuff feels frustrating, you can skim that and then look at his really concrete suggestions for how to see your book with fresh eyes and how to start thinking about it as a book and not a dissertation.
Great, thank you. I mean, and I also just wanted to quickly say both Katherine and Elizabeth mentioned other people who help get your books to publishable formats. I mean, copy editors being one, but indexers, people who make maps, that was something I wasn't anticipating, and promotion. And so, you know, I guess I just want to advocate thinking about your books being this real collective process. And if you're in the position of having funds to hire some of that out, you know, think about that ahead of time, but it makes this whole long process much smoother.
Can I just add one thing to that? I had a postdoc and I had research funds, and I just, for whatever reason, couldn't go to Mauritania that year. And I just, like, I used some of them for a conference, but I had some left over and they just disappeared. If you ever are going to have research funds disappear at the end of the year, hire somebody to do something like this, right? Even if it's just someone to look at a chapter, whatever it is, don't like let those disappear because there are lots of people, or, get someone to index them or whatever. Because that's, again, another thing I regret. Yeah.
Well, let's open things up for question and answer. Rhea, how do you want people to raise their hands, or are they sending?
So the people online can type up their questions.
Okay.
And the people in the room just go with an order. Raise your hand.
I'm so sorry, I have a meeting to go to at 6, but thank you so much. This was so useful.
Maybe I'll start. Break the ice a little bit. I never published my dissertation, and I'm not going to do it now, so I feel pretty comfortable asking this question. So my question is, do all the acquisition editors have the same thinking about how they should be approached, about their role? Do you guys meet and exchange ideas? Or do we have to have the same conversation with several acquisition editors to get a full picture of your expectations? Or there is some baseline, some things you all agree on? Or is this your requirement changes from publisher to publisher, or acquisition editor to acquisition editor? Because I'm asking this because I heard that some acquisition editor will accept to read something that is less than a full book proposal, like a pitch or an idea or a previously published paper, just to get interested. And others, they don't want to hear about anything less than a full-blown book proposal. What type are you?
Sorry, so I can't see the people asking the question, so it's hard for me to like read the social cues of like when the question is done. So yeah, okay, so technically, right, acquisitions editors both like are all working together to further scholarship in a given field, and yet we're also like competing against each other because we all want to publish the best books. And so, so I think, so we're not all getting, there's no cabal where we're all like getting together and being like, this year we're going to do this. Like, this year we are going to read unrevised dissertations. Like, no. I mean, I think there are sort of a baseline number of things we agree on, such as like, most acquisitions editors do not want to read unrevised dissertations. But beyond that, I mean, I think the thing I can't emphasize enough is how relational a field it is and how important relationships are to publishing in general. Not in a like, and it's hard because it sort of sounds kind of gross. Like I know I was trained in my graduate program to like, oh, networking, that's for business people. I'm living the life of the mind. So not to say that like those relationships are not also, they're intellectual relationships, right? It's like building intellectual community, having these important conversations. But it really, yeah, so I'm not, very rarely would someone tell me about their project and I would say, oh, who you should talk to is actually this editor at this press, because I don't want to be in a position of like vouching for someone that I don't really know or having misunderstood what someone's interested in. So I think in general, like, yeah, you do often have to like have the same conversation about your project with a number of acquisitions editors to gauge which one's going to be the right fit. But the important thing about that is like, I have had some conversations with authors where it felt like they were sort of just like in pitch bot mode and didn't want to like actually have a conversation. And I prefer, so ideally, I think if you're sort of approaching it in the open spirit of like, what is the best press for my book? What's the editor who really understands my project? It really should be more of a back and forth instead of you just like repeating the same 4 talking points or whatever to 5 different people. It's like, maybe they're asking you questions and you're like answering them, or maybe they have identified something in your project that you hadn't really thought about. Like there should be room for sort of surprise and exchange in those conversations instead of just like, well, here's my book, take it or leave it, And so I think in that way too, that's like where your question about what do people want to read can also vary widely. So, if I have had a meeting with someone, I think their work is really interesting. maybe they're like, can I send you a chapter? And I'm like, yeah, I would love to read a chapter. Whereas if it's someone who's kind of approaching me cold, I don't know anything about their project, it's like, well, that could be submitted through the online submissions portal and I'll take a look at it that way. So so for example, if someone's like, if I know, right, I'm going to the American Studies conference next week. If someone approaches me and is like, do you want to meet at this conference? If I still have time in my schedule, I will be happy to meet with them. And maybe in advance, I'd say like, could you just send me a paragraph about your work? But if I don't have time to meet with them, I might say, you know, I can't meet with you. So either we could schedule something on Zoom. I think a lot of editors are more open to that. I am not currently doing anything, any one-on-ones on Zoom just because I have such a heavy travel schedule with conferences, but we'll probably do that again in the winter. And I think other editors have adjusted accordingly with the resumption of in-person events as well. So it's certainly possible for someone to maybe review something sort of informally, depending on your relationship, and depending on their preference, but you have to ask. I mean, I would say you just have to ask. Something that I like, for example, something I really don't like is when someone emails me and is like, I have a full proposal. Would Duke be interested in seeing it? I would prefer for them to just to attach the proposal. And then I could just respond and say like, yes, this seems great, or no, this doesn't seem like a fit. As opposed to, because now I have to have like 4 emails about whether or not I'm interested in this proposal, as opposed to 1 email where I could say yes or no. So I think for me, I don't like, but then I was like on a panel with a bunch of acquisitions editors and someone else was like, I love those emails because I am very decisive and I can know right away just from a paragraph whether I like it or not. I'm like, good for you, buddy. Like, so again, it's like, I'm very sorry. There is not a clear yes or no answer. It really is kind of on a case-by-case basis.
So,
Peter, yeah.
so just like building off of that, and you kind of touched on this a lot in this previous response and answered, and also didn't answer my question. But like, is it what is kind of the etiquette then with cold emailing? Or it seems like, is it better to kind of, if you have a friend that's published with that press, have them introduce you to the editor, or is it better to kind of go at it on your own? Or like, what's kind of the best way to facilitate those relationships in the beginning of that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, if you know that someone that is like a mentor or a friend or a colleague has had a good experience like working with an editor, I think it's great to have them introduce you, because I assume that people are not emailing me introductions to people whose work they don't think is good. But that might also put your friend in an awkward position. So again, like I know you're looking for like, yes, do this. And this is because I think that's like, it is one thing I struggle with a little bit in this sort of like proliferation of advice about the academy in general and academic publishing in particular, is that I think people want there to be like a sort of individual answer to structural problems. And sadly, that does not exist. So it's like, oh, if I just craft the perfect book proposal, then every publisher will want my book. And it's like, it's actually not about the getting the structure of the book proposal perfect. It's really about whether or not the idea of the book is a fit for the press. So you want the proposals to be good in the sense of like, you want it to best represent the project. But there are still some projects that are just not going to work, in the same way that like there are a lot of things you could do to like help your email or your approach, your proposal get a positive response. But there's no perfect thing you can do that guarantees that an editor will be like, yes, what a brilliant work. I'd love to publish it right now. And here's $5,000. Like, so, you know, I think that there are a lot of things you can do to like kind of signal your position within an intellectual field and conversation. But there's also like, it's very hard if an editor really is interested in your project and wants to work with you, and if it's a good fit for their press, it's hard to like mess it up too bad. Like like every book, of course, will say like, you know, if you're sending a proposal to Duke Press, don't say this book is a great fit for Stanford Press because of this. On the other hand, like if it's a really good book that I want to publish, I'm not going to I'm going to overlook that. It's like if you're a super strong candidate for a job and the job is going to be like, oh, well, you used a comma instead of a semicolon, like, is it really a good fit? No. So I think that there's a lot of anxiety about what are the tiny little things I can do to be as perfect as possible, which I totally understand because of the totally ridiculous and oppressive and exploitative structural conditions that we're all laboring under. But I think having confidence in your idea and trying to build a relationship with someone are the most important things.
I'll recommend another book. And Elizabeth already mentioned this person, but Laura Portwood-Stacer has recently published the book proposal book. So if you haven't read that, I do think I wish it's another thing. I wish I had that when I was writing my book. But one thing that's helpful in that book, she was a developmental editor and has her PhD and stuff. So she has a lot of experience, but she does help talk through how do you approach a press. She gives sample emails and so on. And so I think it can help just remove some of this anxiety, right, which is very real, and it's a very practical book that talks you through here are the pieces of a book proposal. She gives you activities to do, and by the end, poof, there's your proposal. So anyway, that has helped. She has a lot of helpful kind of overviews of the publishing industry and how that works as well.
She also has a free newsletter that you can subscribe to.
Yes, yeah.
Natalie?
Hi, Elizabeth, it's Natalie. You probably can't see me. But it sounded like you were saying, and I'm wondering if you do think this could also apply to other acquisition editors, that it could also be okay to just say, here are a couple chapters without even the book proposal. I mean, I was just wondering, because you were talking so much about how people get so nervous about the book proposal. Is the book proposal perhaps a dying beast in a sense, or is that not at all the case? I mean, right? How far can people go with just chapters or a full manuscript without the packaged proposal part of it?
Well, with me, you can go pretty far. I have signed up multiple projects for which I've never seen a book proposal. And one thing I like to talk with people about is the idea, I do think book proposals can play a role. I think in terms of mapping out your project, especially in the way Katherine was describing, right? How are you going to arrange your chapters? What's the arc, especially if you're working on a dissertation? A book proposal can be a really helpful place to play and a really helpful place to have in a paragraph. Here's what this book is doing, your mission statement that you can be referring back to. It can also maybe feel less daunting to write a sort of book proposal description than to start on your introduction, because I think often when I'm reading a book proposal, the first 4 pages are actually very similar to the first 10 pages of the introduction, and I would always rather read the introduction than read a book proposal. But in general, in the field, I think the book proposal is an ascendant form. I think that it feels like they have become very important. So I would say if someone is working with me and I feel very confident that it's going to be a book that I'm going to want to do and be able to do here at Duke, then I would usually give them the advice of if you want to write a book proposal because it's a thing, an exercise you would find useful in being able to narrate your project, that's great. But especially if it's a first book, it's not something I'm going to share with reviewers. So it's not a necessary step. But again, a lot of presses work differently. A lot of presses do send out proposal and sample chapters for a first book. There are definitely times when maybe if you need to have a copy of your book proposal in your 3rd-year review file, or it's just it can be a useful document to have. So as much as I'm sort of I personally don't love them, I do think that is a minority position. The other thing I'll say, sorry, is that even if I'm reading someone's work for the first time, even if they're not sending a formal proposal, I do need to have something to position the chapters, right? To understand what I'm reading. So even if it's a paragraph description of the book and a table of contents, so I'm oh, I'm reading chapter 4. And if I'm reading chapter 4, why are we still defining the key terms of the book? Whereas if it was chapter 1, I might be oh, this makes sense because this is where you're explaining this key term of the book after introducing it in the introduction or whatever. But I do think having that kind of context about what someone's reading is always really important, whether it takes the form of a formal 10-page proposal or not.
I have a question about the idea of concentrating on what the book does as opposed to what it is. And I wonder what, for both of our speakers, what you would suggest, or what happens when you have a writer who thinks that their book does one thing, and you think that it does another thing, and how those disputes generally play out, and what you would suggest for a writer who has very strong opinions about what their book does.
I could start. I mean, I think ultimately it's like the audience who decides what the book does, and you're just one reader, right? So I guess I'd say in general, I do think you want to think broadly about what different respondents are going to feel. It's really like, I'll let Elizabeth mostly speak to this because the acquisitions editor would be the person who would be deciding if that difference means your book moves forward or not. I think with the developmental editor, if we are thinking the book is doing something very different than what you think it's doing, part of our job would be to be trying to like make it clear why we're seeing that, right? So it might be like, hey, you think the book is doing this thing, I'm seeing this very different thing the book is doing. Here's why I'm seeing that, and here's like potentially how I think that could work or not work depending on how it is. And then we'd probably talk through like, why am I not seeing your vision? Why is that vision maybe like not coming across as clearly as you want it to be? And what might you need to do to get there, right? If that's what, and maybe the answer, and I think that's one of the like most exciting things about working with clients is sometimes it's somewhere in between, actually, right? Like, and so it's in those conversations or thinking it through with editors where this new path emerges that is actually even more exciting. It's doing something even more exciting, but it's kind of drawing on the different possibilities. And one thing I should say, you obviously like don't have to like work with developmental editors, and I think it can be just like also extraordinarily valuable, right, to have writing groups to exchange with other folks, because you know you do want to think about, if you're thinking about, you're imagining this broader audience and maybe it's scholars from like subfields and different disciplines, you want ideally to have like people from each of those subfields read the book and think about what are they seeing it doing, right? And if they're all, and of course the book can do different things for different people, and that's exciting, right? But if everybody is seeing, if multiple people are not seeing your vision coming across, probably it's not. And so I'm a big believer in getting lots of people to read the book in order to help you suss out, because it is hard as an author. That's one of the hardest things, right? It's like clear in our heads what our books are doing, but we're not there next to the reader to be like, no, you know, like it's this other thing. So anyway, those are some initial thoughts.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Katherine. Thank you. I mean, I think that is one of the kind of classic peer review conundrums. And I often, our former editorial director, Ken Wissaker, likes to use the metaphor of like a film screening. So the peer review process, or even is sort of like a movie, right? So the director's like in the booth, and if they see like, oh, this was supposed to be the big dramatic climax of the movie, but instead people are like giggling, they can't like cut the projector, run into the theater and be like, no, you're totally misinterpreting my film. They have to like, right, go back into the editing room and recut the movie to produce the desired effect. So if you have a very clear idea about what your book is doing and the readers are not getting it, whether it's an acquisitions editor, a developmental editor, peer reviewers, it's like, it is your responsibility to go back and like recut to forward the argument that you think you're forwarding, or to like redeploy the evidence that you have to make sure you're making the point you think you're making. Right. And that's where, that's where just understanding, right, that you're writing for an audience. I think that's such an important point. And that the audience is not getting it. It actually doesn't matter how beautiful a job you think you did. If it's not working, then you have to go back and recut. And so I think that's ultimately it. And I do love the idea that through that process, right, you can be open to changing your idea of what the book's doing and interpreting that in exciting different ways. And I think that is such a wonderful part of the peer review process to me, is having people really push to expand their concept, right? To be more ambitious, to really write into the sort of secret thing that they wanted to say, but maybe felt like they couldn't say as a graduate student, or that they might have been afraid to sort of fully articulate in their job materials, or I think it's so exciting, and it's really a moment of potential.
I also think, just to add one thing on, which also sort of gets to Zachariah's question, is like, I think one reason it's useful in the really early stages to talk to multiple acquisitions editors is because you can get a sense of how people feel about your vision of the book, and sort of maybe what directions they might suggest initially for a vision. And sometimes that's just based on conversation, not even saying anything, and think through, like, does that sort of match with the direction I want my book to go in? And an example, which I gave to some people earlier today, one of my clients is writing a book that is it's a history, and it's partly based around, chapters are organized around like key figures. And he talked to one press, and they were like, we like it. We think we'd like to publish it, but we think it should be organized thematically, which would involve kind of like reworking all the chapters, really. And they had like very good reasons for why they thought that. And this was based on a book proposal and some chapters. So they did like see, and I think even peer reviews. Another press saw that same stuff. They also had suggestions, but they liked the way it was organized. And so that gave the author the opportunity to think through, like, what do I think, right, based on this feedback? And ultimately he decided to go with the press that is keeping it more like his original vision, but he's also, from that other feedback, able to maybe think more broadly within those chapters and so on. So anyway, it's good, I think, to be open in the early stages, right? Because another author could have very well said, yeah, I think it would be a better book if I rework the whole thing, and I have the time to do that, or whatever, so I'm going to go in that direction. And practical considerations are always really important to keep in mind. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for keeping our attention on temporal and practical considerations, Katherine, which are usually of utmost importance, especially for first-time book authors. There is a question in the Q&A. There might also be questions in the room, but I just wanted to call attention to that.
Oh, thank you. Yes. So right, this question is, how important is it to work with the developmental editor in your discipline? How would you choose if you do interdisciplinary work?
Good question. Yeah, I actually I have some notes. I think that varies a little bit. So if you're looking for a developmental editor, just here's some general suggestions I would think about. You'd want to think about you'd want to be sure they have experience and knowledge, right, about scholarly publishing and so on. You want to think about the different kinds of editing they do. Again, are you looking for someone who can do developmental editing and line editing, right? These are just sort of practical things. You'd want to think about, I think, a big thing, which Elizabeth is getting at with the relationships. I think it really matters with a developmental editor. Do you like them? Do you feel that they're supportive? Do you feel like they're going to help you move your book forward, and rather than maybe make you feel worse about, right? And I think I'd say all developmental editors I've met are good at that, but you do want to have that, like, the click, right? That feeling that you click with this person, and you feel like you could trust them, and trust them to take care with your work, right? And recognize that you've put years and years into this, right? And that it really matters to you. So those are some things. I think disciplinary stuff varies, and I think it depends somewhat on what your goals are for the book. So I work with authors in, like, well, I'm a social scientist in anthropology, but one of those disciplines, right, that straddles the humanities and the social sciences, and I have my bachelor's is in literature. So I don't work with people, say, in the natural sciences or things very far from that, right? But I'm mostly working with folks in qualitative social sciences and humanities. Some of my authors specifically like that I am not in their discipline, and they'll say things like, these are people who sort of, they're saying like, I don't need you for content or to evaluate like how I'm using these theoretical things because I have other readers who do that, but I'm wanting to reach a broader audience, right? And so I almost like purposefully want an editor from a related discipline, but not the same discipline, so that you can help me see like what is not making sense to you and so on. So that like, that those people are intentionally wanting someone who's like adjacent, but will be able to read it from a sort of outside perspective. I could, obviously, some people, it can be real smart to work with a developmental editor from your discipline, right? They could, probably give different kinds of feedback about the content, right? Or, be able to say, it seems like the discipline is kind of moving in this direction. Do you want to, and you're sort of touching on that here, but do you want to expand that part, right? Because that might really appeal to an editor, right? So I think there are pluses and minuses to someone in your discipline versus not. And some of it depends on your goals for the text itself. And I'd also say, like, with developmental editors, I think with most people would be open to doing like a chapter first or something, right? A portion, and you can kind of feel out like, what is their feedback like? How do we gel? Do I find their feedback helpful, right? And I don't think that would be the worst idea, because it can be a pretty big, like, long relationship potentially, and you do want to make sure that you click well, and also that the person is just able to communicate in a way that works for you and that is helpful for you. Really good question. And one other thing I'll just say, I have a list of folks who I have, like, editors who I've sort of come into contact in various ways, so you can feel free to reach out if you'd like a copy of that. There's also this organization called the Editorial Freelancers Association, which has maybe like 2,000 freelance editors, meaning people like me who have their own businesses and so on, who are members. They do all kinds of editing, not just academic, but copy editing, line editing, et cetera, coaching. And so that's a place. They have a directory you can search through to look for people, and you can put in disciplines. So you could find, if you're looking for people in a specific discipline, find people who do that work. If their directory, I think, can be a little unwieldy just because there are so many folks in there. So they also have a job board, and you can post write up a post. I think it's free to use, and sort of say what you're looking for in an editor. My one suggestion is, like, if you post a job on there, you will get like a lot of responses. So you'd want to try to be specific in the post about what you're looking for and so on. But I also think a great way to find developmental editors is just word of mouth. It's nice if you have a colleague who's worked with someone, because, and if they have, and they say, I like this person, I think it's a smart idea to say, like, why, right? Can you tell me a little bit about how that person worked? What were they like? And so on, just to sort of feel out initially, is this somebody who would be worthwhile talking to, and so on.
Natalie, and I think that will be our last question.
Oh, well, I could just say something then to that on my own experience. So I worked with the developmental editor for my first book, and I'm working now with one for my second book. And with the first book, I mean, it was always good to have these deadlines. I mean, to feel like there's somebody I had to keep sending material to, because it can get lost in all the other stuff one is doing. With the first book, I was getting responses where the developmental editor would write back and say, okay, your chapter did this and this and this. And my feeling was always kind of like, well, yeah, I know, I wrote it. I mean, so I didn't feel like it was pushing me forward, but I stayed with the person because of the deadlines. The developmental editor I have now is making, when I read the responses, it's like, oh, right. Yes, that's what I am doing, but wasn't fully even aware of. Thank you. Right? Because now what I see instead, it's not the, yes, okay, of course that's what I'm doing because I wrote it. I know what my chapter says. It's the, I hadn't that's exactly what I had wanted to say, but I did, or it was kind of more in the subconscious, and I didn't realize, and that's another way I could look at it, another thing to bring in. So it's been wonderful. It's been very helpful. And I think I think it's probably worth sending a chapter out to Katherine or any other developmental editor and getting a sense of what that feedback does for you. And if it helps move you along, that's, great. And then if not, it's still wonderful to have the deadlines, but then you might want to look for an editor who's able to do that extra, right, kind of push in a sense.
Yeah, because research money is always finite, right? So you want to be sure you're spending that wisely, and it's not even if you decide to like not work with your editor anymore. It's not like you're just saying that's like you're a terrible editor, right? It's saying like, for whatever reason we're not a match. And just one last thing on the disciplinary thing. Obviously, don't hire someone whose discipline is like, if you're a sociologist, don't hire someone who's like specializes in biology for developmental. And a good editor would typically say, like, if someone contacts me and it's not really my discipline, I would point that out, right? And the person might say, I know, but I really want someone like far from and then that's one thing. But typically, we point the person in a different direction to make sure that.
Hello, my last question.
Yes, thank you.
So what is the right time to get in touch with the development editor?
Yeah, good question.
Developmental editor.
Yeah, so as Elizabeth alluded to, there's a big demand right now for, I think a lot of people didn't know what developmental editors were, just like me, and so all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but I do feel that there's a big demand. So a lot of folks are booking up like several months in advance. So I would say the best time to get in touch is like as soon as you are thinking, right? Like that you say 6 months out is not too early, right? Or not, yeah. I don't know, sure, not too late. Yeah, like ahead, right?
Yeah,
so,
I mean, what stage of
at
my
what
own
stage?
writing I should get.
Oh, right. Yeah, so that kind of depends on your goals, and again, it can be at really any stage. So some people want someone like right from the start and find that helpful. I think a lot of authors want to wait till they have more things written. So and some of that's just practical, like how much research money do you have that you can devote to this and so on. But I'd also say, like, I think a good time to reach out to the developmental editors is when you're stuck. Although, again, they might not be able to work with you for several months, right? But if you're feeling like I am not making progress on this and I really need to be, and I'm super stressed because of this tenure clock or whatever it is, I think that's a good time. I mean, and it's probably better to do it before then so you don't get to that point. But I think, yeah, this process does not have to be as hard as it is. And I think developmental editors and good acquisitions editors, right, just finding people you can have good relationships with, good matches with, can really help make it less painful and continue to demystify it parts of the process.
Elizabeth, is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, this was great. Wonderful questions. I really appreciated the opportunity to learn more from Katherine about how she sees our work together. So thanks, everyone. It's really wonderful.